Montana Territory, 1882, snow still clung to the edges of the dirt road through Helena when Susanna Kline stepped down from the stagecoach, her travel-worn boots hitting the ground with a quiet thump. The wind cut sharp through her wool coat, but she stood tall, smoothing her skirts and lifting her chin. She had not come this far to be bowed by weather or stares. At 38, she was no stranger to life's blows. A widow for nearly a decade, with her only son buried back in Ohio, Susanna had poured her heart into raising two young girls left in her care after her sister died in childbirth. Bethany and Belle were not hers by blood, but she had loved them like they were. And now, at 16 and 14, they were with a kind neighbor couple back home safe, warm, and cared for while Susanna answered an ad that promised a new beginning. A man named Thomas Whitmore had written her. A widower with a modest cattle ranch outside Helena. He wanted a steady woman. Someone mature, capable, and of sound mind and heart. His words, not hers. He had seen enough of flighty girls and wanted someone with a good head and gentle hands, so she wrote back. Truthfully, she told him her age, her experiences, her hopes. He replied with warmth. But the man who met her outside the general store was not the one who had written those letters. "You're older than I thought," Thomas said, jaw tight, eyes flicking over her like she was a horse he had changed his mind about. "You saw my age in every letter," Susanna said, voice steady. "I thought maybe you exaggerated or had a soft hand with the truth." He glanced away. "I cannot marry you, I am sorry." He turned and walked off. Just like that, Susanna stood frozen, her fingers curled in her gloves, the ache in her chest sharp and fast. She kept her tears in, though her throat burned. She had no money to return east, and she would not go begging. She walked. Carrying her satchel and her pride, she passed the edge of town, past the livery, until her legs trembled and her feet throbbed. Finally, she sat near the edge of the corral fence by the big oak tree, not caring who saw. She folded her hands in her lap and stared out at the wind-tossed grass. "You looking to buy a horse?" a voice asked behind her. She turned slowly. A tall man leaned against the fence, hat tipped back. He had eyes like warm earth and the kind of calm that came from years of silence. His coat was patched at the elbow, his boots worn, but he stood like a man who knew where he belonged. "No," she said. "I was just catching my breath." He studied her for a beat. "Saw you come in on the coach." "You were supposed to be marrying Tom Whitmore." Supposed to. The word stung. "He changed his mind." The man nodded once. "Fool," he muttered. That surprised her. "You know him?" "Well enough to know he never deserved the kind of woman who steps off a coach with her head high, even when her heart's breaking." Her breath caught. No one had ever said something like that to her, not even her late husband. He pushed off the fence and walked around to stand in front of her, not too close. "Name's Elias Vaughn. I got a small spread about 5 miles west of here. I raise cattle, live quiet. I was not looking for a wife, but—" He paused, eyes steady. "Maybe I just did not know what I was missing." Susanna stared up at him, blinking against the wind. "Are you offering to marry me?" "I am offering a place to rest, a safe place. You can decide later if you want to stay longer." She hesitated. She did not know this man, but she had nothing else. And something in his voice, low, steady, kind, made her feel like maybe she could breathe again. She rose to her feet. Her legs shook, but she kept her back straight. "I accept your offer," she said. Elias nodded once. "Come on then. My horse is tied up around back. We will ride double unless you are too proud to hold onto a stranger." She surprised herself by smiling. "I have held tighter to worse." They rode through open country, the late afternoon sun dipping low. The wind calmed as the trees grew thicker and the land opened into a quiet valley. His house stood plain but sturdy, smoke curling from the chimney. A barn, a lean-to, a small pasture with half a dozen cattle. It was not much, but it was clean. Honest, inside, the warmth hit her first, then the smell of coffee and wood smoke. He set her bag near the hearth and poured her a tin cup of water from the kettle. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He handed her a plate of bread and beans, then sat across from her, quiet as she ate, not watching, just nearby, like he was giving her space but not letting her drift too far. Afterward, she stood, uneasy. "Where should I sleep?" "My room's got a second cot," Elias said. "I will take the floor tonight. You can have the bed." She hesitated. "I do not expect anything," he said. "You are not mine unless you choose to be." That night, she lay under a wool blanket, listening to the wind outside. Elias's breathing was steady from the floor across the room, and for the first time in weeks, her heart did not feel so heavy. The next morning, he handed her a mug of hot coffee. "You can stay as long as you like, Susanna," she met his eyes. "What if I chose to stay forever?" He looked at her long and quiet, then said, "Then I would be the luckiest man in Montana." She flushed, but she did not look away. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clear. And for the first time in a long while, Susanna Kline felt like maybe she was not too old for anything. Maybe she was just right for someone like Elias Vaughn. The cold held on longer than usual that spring, with the ground reluctant to soften and the creek behind Elias's barn still edged in ice. Susanna rose early each day, brushing her hair back into a coil and tying on a borrowed apron before he returned from morning chores. The first week passed with a rhythm neither of them named quiet meals, shared labor, and space where silence was not a punishment but a comfort. On the 8th day, Elias paused at the doorway as she stood kneading dough at the table. "You ever worked cattle?" he asked, voice low but not uncertain. "I've worked a kitchen that fed 10 field hands and a house with 2 sick babies." "I reckon that's not the same, but I've done what had to be done." He scratched at the back of his neck. "I could use a second set of hands when calving starts, might be another week. Never liked asking for help, but I ain't fool enough to turn down good sense and strong arms." Susanna wiped her palms on a cloth. "If you show me, I'll learn." He nodded once, then stepped outside without another word. That afternoon, she walked the stretch of land behind the barn, memorizing the fence lines, the slope of the hills, the way the snow melted in patches where the sun hit hardest. She found the smokehouse tucked behind a stand of pine and ran her fingers over the rough-hewn boards, thinking of all the ways survival stitched itself into the bones of a place. Inside, she found Elias sharpening a drawknife at the workbench, the shavings from some earlier project still curled like paper on the floor. "You built this house yourself?" she asked, started it 2 winters back. "Took longer than I meant." She moved closer, eyes on the plane of the wall where the boards met clean. "It's solid. You've got a steady hand." He set the knife down and turned to face her. "You think you'll want to write your nieces come Sunday?" "There's a man in town hall's mail twice a week." "I'd like that." She hesitated. "They'll be worried. I should let them know I'm safe." He picked up a folded square of paper from the shelf. "You can use this. And I'll have a fresh pencil by morning." She reached for the paper and their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. Later, as twilight settled, she brought out a jar of preserves she'd packed from Ohio blackberry, thick and dark, and spread it over the biscuits she'd baked that morning. Elias took a bite, then paused. "This tastes like something I forgot I missed." She smiled without looking at him. "Then it's good I brought 2 jars." He leaned back in his chair, legs stretched toward the fire. "You were married long, 7 years. Was he kind?" He tried to be. But he carried grief in his chest like a stone, died before he could set it down. Elias stared into the flames. "I understand that." She placed her mug on the table. "You lost her in childbirth." He nodded. "Took the baby too. That was 6 winters ago." Buried them under the cottonwood near the ridge. The wind shifted and the fire popped. No one spoke for a long time. Then Elias stood. "I'll fetch more wood." She watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Her eyes lingered on the chair he'd left, the way the cushion still held his shape. That night when she lay beneath the wool blanket, she turned her face toward the cot instead of the wall. "Elias," he stirred. "Yes, thank you for not sending me back." His voice came quiet from the dark. "Didn't feel right watching you stand there like no one saw you. I saw you." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something unspoken, stretching between them like new ground waiting for seed. The wind had shifted by the time the first calf came. Morning broke pale and cold, and Elias had already saddled the mare by the time Susanna stepped into the yard with her coat buttoned to the throat and her braid tucked beneath a scarf. He handed her a length of rope and a steady look before turning west toward the pasture. The heifer was down near the far fence, flanks heaving, hooves slick with ice melt. Elias slid from the saddle and crouched low to check her, then straightened. "She'll need help," he said. "You feel up to it." Susanna didn't answer with words. She stepped off the mare, knelt beside the animal, and waited for his instruction. By midday, the calf was born, wet and blinking, its shaky legs tucked beneath it. Elias rubbed it down with a feed sack while Susanna kept the mother calm. When the calf finally stood, knobby and unsure, Elias looked over his shoulder. "You're not afraid of much, are you? I learned early that fear doesn't get the bread baked or the field cleared." He nodded once, then turned back to the calf without comment, but his shoulders eased just a little. That evening, while she peeled potatoes at the table, Elias rested a ledger on his knee and studied his figures by lamplight. He tapped the pencil once, then glanced her way. "You ever done any keeping? Numbers, I mean." "I helped my father tally seed orders," she said, setting the knife aside. "And I kept account for the man who ran the mill back home after his eyes went bad." He handed her the ledger. "I've been meaning to sort out the grain stores. You might see clearer than I do." She took it without hesitation. "I'll look at it after supper." Later, once the fire had burned low and the ledger was closed with a scrap of thread marking her place, Elias stood by the window, arms crossed. "This life, it's plain, hard sometimes. It's not what most women would want." Susanna dried her hands on her apron. "Most women didn't come here with nothing but a satchel and a name they were willing to offer. I didn't come west hunting silk or silver." He turned, his outline dark against the glass. "What did you come looking for?" She thought about the letter she'd never sent, the one she'd written in the dark after her sister's funeral, folded and tucked in her prayer book. It had said only, "I want a place where I can lay my burdens down and be known, not pitied." "I came looking for a place to be useful," she said, "and maybe, if I was fortunate, a place to be wanted." Elias stepped back from the window. "I don't need much," he said. "But it's been a long while since there was someone here who waited for me to come in from the barn or made coffee without being asked." She met his gaze. "You think that's enough for a life together?" His voice came quiet. "I think it's more than I ever expected again." She didn't answer right away. She crossed the room, slow and certain, and stood beside him. For a long moment they looked out at the empty yard, the moonlight catching on the frost-bitten grass. "Then I'll stay," she said. "Not for a season." "For good." Elias didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. The space between them was already filled with something steady and growing. "That'd suit me just fine," he said, and in the hush that followed, Susanna felt it, not a rush, not a spark, but the deep warmth of something real taking root. The first seeds went into the ground once the frost finally lifted, soft rows dug by hand and marked with short stakes Elias had carved from pine. Susanna wore her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her palms dry with soil as she pressed beans into the earth with quiet precision. Elias worked beside her, never rushing, keeping pace with her stride. They didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because the work said enough shared labor, unspoken rhythm. Later that week, she found the root cellar half empty and the preserves shelf leaning slightly. She mentioned it after supper while folding linens near the hearth. "I could repack the cellar if you've got spare crates," she said. "It'd keep better if nothing's shifting around." Elias set down the harness he'd been mending. "There's some in the loft. I'll bring them down for you in the morning." Before bed, she took a tin of flour to the table and began measuring with practiced care. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her fingers move. "You always measure exact like that?" he asked. "I had to." Her voice was quiet but sure. "When you've only got enough for one more batch, you learn not to waste." He nodded, then stepped forward and ran a cloth over the table beside her, slow and even. "Seems like you've lived through seasons most folks don't talk about." She glanced at him. "I have, but I've also come through them." He didn't answer, but he stayed near as she worked, the silence between them warm and unhurried. By late April, the cow with the lame leg birthed twins. One didn't make it. Elias didn't speak for the better part of the day, just buried the small body near the hedge line and patched the fence without pause. Susanna brought him a tin of water when the sun hit high and set it on the post beside him. "I know better than to fuss," she said. But you should drink something. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve and took the tin. Some days wear heavier than others. She didn't press. She just stood beside him a while, her shadow long next to his. That evening, as dusk settled low, he reached for a small box from the shelf above the hearth. Inside were buttons, bits of lace, and a single brass key. This was hers, he said, holding up a faded scrap of ribbon. She tied it around her braid when she rode fence with me. Said it made her feel less like the wind could carry her away. Susanna looked at the ribbon, then at him. Would you like me to put it somewhere else? No, he said. Just thought you ought to see what's been kept. She closed the box gently and placed it back where it had been. Then she turned to him, steady. I'm not here to replace what was, I'm here to build what comes next. He met her eyes. That's what I hoped you'd say. The next morning, she rose early and began stitching a new curtain for the kitchen window. She worked standing, measuring against the light as it fell across the floor. Elias came in with mud on his boots and paused when he saw the fabric draped across the table. You making changes? He asked. No, she said, tying a knot. Just mending what needed it. He stepped closer and ran a finger along the hem. That's fine work. I stitched it from an old petticoat, figured the fabric deserved a second life. He looked at her, then not past her, not through her, but with a kind of quiet knowing. So do you, he said. She didn't reply, but her hands stilled on the cloth, and when she met his gaze, her smile was slow and certain. That night, he set a second cup on the table without asking if she wanted one. She poured them both coffee and passed him the sugar tin. You always take it with one spoon, she noted. You notice that? I notice most things that matter, she said. He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, I reckon I do too. Outside, the owls had begun to call low and steady from the trees. Inside, the warmth of the lamp flickered across the floorboards and nothing else needed saying. By mid-May, the creek behind the barn swelled with thaw and ran fast over the stones, loud enough that Susanna could hear it at night through the open window above her bed. The air held a damp sweetness now, and the spruce trees beyond the pasture stretched greener by the day. She'd begun hanging wash along the fence line, pinning it between the sunniest gaps where the wind dried linen quicker than any fire. Elias had taken to reading the old almanac in the evenings, seated with one leg resting across his knee, his thumb tucked into the pages like he didn't intend to stop long but always did. That night, as Susanna folded the last of the dry muslin and set it in the chest at the foot of the bed, he looked up. There's a gathering over at the Granger place next week, barn dance and supper. I never had much cause to go before. She didn't turn from the chest. You asking if I'd care to? I am, she closed the lid gently. I'd need a day in town. The hem of my good dress is frayed near the hem, and I haven't got shoes suitable for dancing. I'll bring the wagon into Helena Thursday. We'll go together, he said. She wiped her hands on her apron. Don't expect I remember every step, but I haven't forgotten how to follow a good lead. He set the almanac aside. You won't have to try hard. I've got 2 left feet, but I can keep time when it matters. On the day of the dance, the town was thick with spring bustle. Elias lingered outside the mercantile while Susanna stepped inside with a list folded in her pocket. She chose a length of indigo calico and a spool of thread to match, then paused at the counter where the shoemaker's daughter displayed a row of polished leather slippers. These, Susanna said, pointing to the pair with the smallest scuff near the heel. They'll last a season at least. Back at the ranch, Elias hitched the horses early and shaved beside the pump, combing his hair with more care than usual. Susanna dressed behind the curtain hung across the corner of the room, her fingers steady as she fastened the last button at her collar. When she stepped out, Elias stood from the chair and set down his tin cup. You look like you belong to every good thing that's ever grown from this land, he said. She narrowed her eyes, smiling. You practicing sweet talk now? No, he said. Just speaking truth plain. The Granger barn had been cleared and packed with neighbors, the fiddle player stomping time while couples turned slow in the wide space. Susanna let Elias lead her once around the floor, then twice, their boots brushing sawdust in rhythm. He held her as if he'd been born knowing the shape of her, one hand steady at her back, the other warm in hers. Later, they sat on the steps outside, the lantern light spilling through the open doors behind them. The night smelled of lilac and smoke, the prairie stretching dark and still beyond the fence line. "I used to think my life ended when I buried her," Elias said, eyes fixed on the stars, "but I was wrong. It just stood still a long while." Susanna leaned her shoulder against his. "So did mine." But stillness isn't death, it's waiting, and waiting has its own kind of hope. He turned to her then, his face close, his expression unguarded. "I want to marry you proper, not just share space and chores. I want your name beside mine in the church book. I want to stand up beside you in front of folks who'll know what it means." She didn't hesitate. "Then take me Sunday, Elias Vaughn. I've worn my widow's name long enough." They married in the small clapboard church west of town, with the preacher's wife humming a hymn and a few neighbors gathered in their Sunday best. Susanna wore a simple cream dress she'd sewn from the calico she'd saved, and Elias wore the same coat he'd worn to bury his father, pressed clean and brushed free of dust. He didn't kiss her in front of the others, just touched her hand gently and looked at her like she was the start of every season to come. That night, back at the ranch, Susanna unpinned her hair and set their marriage certificate in the drawer where the ledger used to be. Elias stood behind her, arms loose at his sides. "You sure?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. She turned and wrapped her arms around his waist, her cheek resting against his chest. "I've never been more." He held her then, long and quiet, his hand at the back of her neck, his breath steady near her ear. They built a life that year, not grand but whole. She planted a row of herbs beneath the kitchen window, and he built her a bench beside it. They opened the pasture fence to let the herd graze wider, and he taught her to read the sky for weather. In the fall, she wrote to her nieces and told them they had a place if they ever wished to come west. One did, the younger, Belle, who arrived with a hand-stitched valise and eyes wider than the sky. Susanna and Elias added a room to the house that winter, and another the next. They grew into each other, not with sudden fire, but with the kind of warmth that never flickered. Quiet hands at the table, boots beside one another at the door, voices low and sure in the dark. Years passed, and laughter returned to the house. Not the loud kind, but the kind that curled up in corners and stayed. And when Elias grew older and his knees stiffened in the cold, Susanna rubbed them with oil made from the herbs she'd grown herself. They never needed to speak of the past again. It was there, of course, like the roots beneath the prairie grass, holding firm. But the life they'd built was stronger than memory, and when the wind moved over the land each spring, it carried with it the sound of two people who had known loss and chosen love anyway.